memories, they don't work the way you think they do. In fact, there's a secret connection between dreams and memory. Hello again, Internet. So today we're going to talk about the weird, mysterious link between memories and dreams. Now, I should say that it doesn't work the way you think it does unless you're a researcher in memory, obviously. But most of us have a particular idea of how we think memory works. And it typically goes something like this. We experience something, and then we store it in a storage bank somewhere in the brain, and then later on we retrieve it, we pull it back, take a look at it. That's not really how it works. Actually, it goes back to Aristotle. And his argument was that when things happen to us, they impress upon our minds in the same way that a seal makes an impression on wax. And then the experience goes away, the impression is still there. So that's a very passive way of looking at memory. And what we know now is that memory is way more active than that. Now, things happen to us and they do somehow change what's going on in the brain, but it doesn't make an impression like that to be retrieved later fully formed. Now, what happens is when we retrieve memories, when we retrieve them, we actually construct a narrative based on what happened to us, and it's a very active, constructive process. And in the course of this, we typically will get a memory that is pretty accurate, but there's a lot of inaccuracies that often get imported into these narratives that we report as memories. So when we're remembering things, our minds will actually do a whole lot of tricks. They'll compress events, they will add details where there weren't there, sometimes completely fabricate parts of it. Very often they will cohere with our own pre-existing beliefs. Memories also tend to align themselves with our current emotional state. So if you think back about what happened to you 10 years ago, you may have a different experience of remembering that depending on what kind of mood you're in. There's another thing that happens called imagination inflation. And that's when you imagine a particular event happening enough times that you think it's actually a real memory. That can be a big problem in therapy, and it was several decades ago with the whole repressed memory phenomenon. People found that when they talked about memories as if they were repressed, what seemed to be happening is we could implant memories into people, sometimes leading to disastrous results. Thankfully, we've learned enough not to do that anymore. But you might ask, well, what's the point of memory working like that? It seems strange. But remember, the purpose of memory is not to perfectly regurgitate things that actually happened to you verbatim. The purpose of memory is to create a coherent self-narrative, to create a clear causal picture between what happened to us in the past and where we are now. And in order to do that, sometimes the brain has to cheat a little bit. And it sometimes will fill in the details where we might have missed bits and pieces here and there. So now in the title of the video, I suggest that there's a link between dreams and memory. And what is that? Well, it turns out that dreaming seems to improve our ability to consolidate our memories. When we find that when we interrupt people from dreaming, they can't remember as well as if we allow it to happen. So that's an interesting link, but there's more. So there's an interesting thing that happens with memories and dreams. And when something happens to me, it will often get incorporated into my dream content, but it's not perfectly even. So I might have something happen to me. Typically, I won't see it appear in my dream content for a couple of days. Then it kind of shifts out of the picture and then comes back again 5 to 7 days again. So in other words, if I had an argument with a friend, say, 2 days later is when I'll typically see that theme or that event work itself into my dream content. Then it might not show up for another 5 to 7 days. This is called the dream lag effect. So Now, the interesting thing about the dream lag effect is that the second time I see it, it won't be as close to what happened to me as the first time. It'll oftentimes be more abstract. It'll be more thematic or metaphorical in nature. In other words, rather than dreaming about arguing with that person, even if it's not exactly the same thing we were arguing about in reality, the second time I see it, it'll be an argument with someone maybe who resembles that person but isn't actually them. So it's more abstract. It could be a generic figure that I'm having the same argument with. So the upshot of that is the relationship between dream and memory is that dream content doesn't just take things that happen to us and repeat them over and over again, except in the case of trauma dreams, which we'll get to in a minute. Normally, though, it takes our autobiographical memory, breaks it up into pieces, and then reorganizes it into new symbolic narratives. Now, the symbolic narratives, like we talked about in the first video, are emotionally concerned metaphors. They concern our emotional needs. So the dream content that has taken that autobiographical memory and broken it up into pieces and put it together in a different way will give us a dream narrative, and the dream narrative will be a symbolic narrative based on what happened to us. So the goal of that process is to put together a coherent dream narrative based on our emotional needs. Now, you can see then that the connection between dreams and memory is that both processes are involved in putting together and constructing a story that assists us in creating a coherent sense of who we are and how we got here and what it all means. So the memory process creates a causal chain of events that led up to where I am in its stories, whereas the dream narratives do the same thing but rearrange it into a symbolic narrative that tells us what it all means. It's as if this is happening, using bits and pieces of what happened to me to tell the story. So, what is the common theme between these two processes then? It's the imagination. In fact, it's not just the imagination, it's the imagination that's working without conscious direction, because both of these processes emerge like that, without consciously willing it to exist. Now, you can really see this in post-traumatic stress. PTSD can actually impair our imagination. And, not surprisingly, folks that have PTSD struggle with memory, particularly around the events of the trauma, but they also have an impaired ability to imagine scenarios posed to them by researchers, and their dreams tend to be less abstract, less creative, less hyper-associative. They're more concrete. Now, in therapy, I definitely see that. And what typically happens is a person will have traumatic dreams that are just repeats of the trauma. But then after a while, the creative capacity comes back, and the dreams will start to rearrange and put things together in creative new ways. That's when I know they're getting better. So it's very important to be able to recognize this. The imagination drives both processes. It works behind the scenes constantly to not only build a coherent memory narrative, but a coherent dream narrative on top of that. Both orient to emotion by default. Of course, the imagination can also be conjured up by the will to work on something new, a creative project or daydreaming or what have you. But it's going on all the time on its own anyway in the background, and that sometimes you'll see that in memories that just pop in your mind, or of course when we're dreaming, when these fully formed narratives pop up and we become immersed in them. Anyway, so that's the mysterious connection between dreams and memory. I hope you found that interesting, and if you liked it, you know what to do. And until then, I'll see you next time.